It all started when our HOA sent out a letter one day, something that looked like a typical newsletter, but with a twist. As soon as I opened it, I couldn't believe my eyes. They were claiming they had special authority to patrol our neighborhood. And I'm not talking about regular security guards. No, these people were acting like they were the local police force, but without the badges or the training. Imagine that. A bunch of HOA board members who barely know how to run a yard sale, thinking they could have the power to control who comes in and out of the neighborhood. At first, we thought it was a mistake, maybe some kind of joke. But as the days passed, it became clear they weren't kidding. The letter included a detailed plan for what they called a private patrol, with all kinds of rules about parking, walking, and even where we could sit in our own yards. It was absurd. They even had the nerve to tell us that they were doing this for community safety, as if the biggest crime around here was people parking too close to the curb. Now, this is where it starts to get a little sketchy. How could they think they had the right to do this? Wasn't this something the police should handle, not a bunch of overzealous neighbors with way too much time on their hands? The more I thought about it, the more I realized something wasn't right. Who gave them this power? Was anyone else even aware that this was happening? The more we tried to talk about it, the more we realized that no one knew what to do, and that's when the tension started building. People were getting worried. Would they really start showing up at our doors, telling us what to do? What would happen if we ignored their patrols? Stay tuned, because it wasn't long before things went from weird to downright frightening. The moment the HOA's bold claim hit our mailboxes, it didn't take long for the neighborhood to erupt. At first, people thought it was just another overzealous letter from an HOA board that liked to remind us of rules no one asked for. But as the days passed, it became clear that the board wasn't playing around. They were serious about this so-called private patrol, and that's when the neighborhood started to get really uneasy. You could see the frustration building in the community. Whispers turned into full-blown conversations, and soon enough, people were meeting up in small groups, talking about what they could do. And let me tell you, the more they discussed it, the angrier they got. People started sharing stories about their experiences with the HOA, how they had been fined for things as silly as their mailbox being an inch too high, or their lawn not being manicured enough for the HOA's standards. It became clear that this wasn't about safety, it was about control. Everyone was fed up, and the talk of community safety was just a smokescreen for their real agenda. As the protests started to grow, a small group of us decided we weren't just going to sit around and let this happen. We needed to do something. Some people went door to door, asking neighbors to join a meeting to discuss how to push back. Others started an online petition to get the HOA's patrol plan canceled. The word spread like wildfire. Suddenly, it wasn't just a handful of us, it was the whole block. The thing about HOAs is that they have this illusion of authority. They tell you what to do, but they forget that they're just a group of homeowners who think their little set of rules applies to everyone. People started speaking out, loudly and clearly, about how unacceptable this patrol was. And I can't even begin to tell you how many people started showing up to HOA meetings. It wasn't a few disgruntled voices anymore. It was a full-blown protest, with every other neighbor questioning how far the HOA was willing to go. Some of us even started digging into the legality of what the HOA was doing. Were they even allowed to patrol like this? Was it within their rights to invade our privacy this way? The questions grew more intense by the minute, and tensions were rising. Just when it seemed like the HOA was going to dig in their heels and ignore all the protests, a surprising turn of events happened. A former board member reached out to one of us, whispering about some shady deals going down behind closed doors. But what did they know? What were they about to reveal? I couldn't shake the feeling that the deeper we dug, the more we were uncovering a conspiracy that went beyond just a bunch of overstep. And right then, it became clear. The fight was far from over. Everyone was gearing up for a showdown, and I had no idea just how wild it was going to get. It had been weeks since the HOA announced their ridiculous plans to patrol our neighborhood like they were some kind of private security force. And by this point, we'd all had enough. The protests were growing. The community was more divided than ever, and honestly, no one was sure where this was going to lead. Some neighbors were still on the fence, thinking the HOA was just bluffing, but others were getting downright paranoid. Would the HOA actually start sending people out to monitor our every move? Would we be arrested for something as harmless as walking our dogs too close to someone's driveway? As the pressure mounted, the HOA seemed more and more like they were treating us all like criminals. It felt like we were living under their constant surveillance. And the patrol idea wasn't just intrusive, it was downright terrifying. No one had the guts to confront them head-on, especially since the board members were acting so confident about their so-called special authority. They seemed to think they were above the law, and honestly, that was when the problem became bigger than just a few annoyed neighbors. We couldn't let this go on. At that moment, a small group of us decided to take a drastic step. It wasn't just about fighting their control over our personal lives anymore. It was about making sure they understood that they didn't have the right to break the law to enforce their petty rules. We all knew what had to be done, and the one thing we all had in common was that none of us was afraid to stand up for what was right. So, we did it. We called the police. But not just for some minor complaint or to ask a few questions. No, we were about to escalate this situation to a level the HOA never saw coming. It was one thing to have your neighbors mad at you, but when the law gets involved, that's a whole other game. The phone call was made, and the wheels started turning. The police arrived within a few hours, and the atmosphere changed instantly. You could feel the tension in the air. People were watching, waiting for something to happen. And when the officers began questioning the HOA, the real drama unfolded. The HOA members tried to act all calm and collected, like they had everything under control, but I could tell they were panicking inside. The police weren't buying their claims of special authority, or their attempt to act like they were some sort of neighborhood watch. The more the officers pressed them, the more the HOA started to crack. They tried to defend themselves by citing some vague, non-existent rules that they said gave them the right to patrol, but none of it made sense. It was clear that they were making this up as they went along. I watched as the officers exchanged glances, realizing they had been dealing with a group of people who had absolutely no understanding of how the law worked. One of the officers turned to the rest of us, and that's when it hit me. They were taking this seriously. This wasn't just a simple neighborhood squabble anymore. It was turning into something far more serious. The police weren't just here to listen to complaints. They were here to investigate whether the HOA had been breaking the law. And that's when the real shocker came. It turned out that the HOA didn't just cross some ethical line. They were potentially violating local ordinances, and the police had the power to shut them down. The police weren't just going to talk to them and let it slide. They were here to make sure the HOA's self-appointed authority wasn't going to run wild anymore. The moment was surreal. The entire neighborhood stood there, watching as the officers took control of the situation. It was like we were witnessing the unraveling of the HOA's twisted power trip, and no one knew how far this was going to go. But just when I thought it couldn't get any crazier, the HOA board tried to play their last card. They claimed they were working with the city council on the patrol plan, as if that would give them some kind of legitimacy. But the officers weren't buying it. In fact, they told the board that the city had no idea what they were talking about, and that their special authority was nothing but a delusion. The board members were speechless. I had never seen them so rattled. They looked like they were about to explode, but no one was afraid anymore. The police were here, and they were making sure the HOA's reign of terror was over. It was a small victory for the neighborhood, but the real question was, what would the HOA do next? Would they try to fight back, or had they finally met their match? The tension in the air was thick as we all waited for the police to make their final decision. But in that moment, it was clear. Things were about to get even more complicated. We weren't done yet. The fight was just beginning. After weeks of mounting tension and frustration, it felt like the HOA's ridiculous plans to patrol our neighborhood had reached their breaking point. I mean, we'd gone from trying to ignore it, to complaining about it, to outright organizing protests. Still, the HOA seemed determined to push ahead with this private patrol scheme, and no one in the neighborhood had the courage to stand up to them, at least not yet. But things were about to change. I remember the day everything shifted. It was a Sunday morning when I received a call from one of my neighbors. Let's call her Linda. She was furious, practically yelling into the phone about how the HOA had just sent a team of people into the streets, acting like they had the right to monitor everyone's movements. The thing was, they didn't have the police. They didn't have badges, and they certainly didn't have the authority to dictate our daily lives. But there they were, wearing vests that looked like they were straight out of some ridiculous neighborhood watch group. The absurdity was palpable. Linda wasn't alone in her outrage. That very same afternoon, I walked down the street to find several of my neighbors standing outside, arguing with the HOA members who were practically pacing around like they owned the place. At that point, something inside me snapped. I couldn't sit back and let them walk all over us anymore. The HOA had crossed a line. The moment I decided to act, I knew I had to go big. I wasn't just going to send an angry letter or make a complaint at the next meeting. I had to make a statement that would shake them to their core. That's when the idea hit me like a lightning bolt. If they were going to treat us like criminals in our own homes, then maybe it was time to involve the real authorities, the police. But not just any police. I was talking about the kind of police that were used to handling real criminals, not HOA power trips. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed like the only logical step. I had no idea how the HOA would react, but I figured they'd have to at least think twice if law enforcement was involved. I called up a few neighbors who I knew were on the same page, and without wasting another second, we got to work. We filed a formal complaint with the police, stating that the HOA was attempting to enforce rules and authority that went beyond what was legal or appropriate. And just like that, the ball started rolling. The next thing I knew, the police were making plans to investigate. And honestly, the thought of seeing those HOA board members squirm in front of real law enforcement made me feel like we were finally going to get the justice we deserved. It wasn't just a matter of right or wrong anymore. It was about showing the HOA that they couldn't run roughshod over our rights. What happened next is something I'll never forget. The police actually showed up at our neighborhood, and not just one officer, but a whole team of them. I'll admit, I was shocked. The officers didn't waste time. They walked right up to the HOA members like they were business as usual, but you could tell they weren't impressed by the special authority nonsense the board had been spewing. There was no small talk. The officers got straight to the point, questioning the HOA about their patrol plan and whether or not they had any legal grounds to be acting like some sort of private police force. The board members, who had been walking around with their heads held high just moments before, started looking uncomfortable. I swear, it was like watching a bunch of kids caught sneaking into a forbidden place. They tried to play it off at first, acting like they had everything under control, but the more the police questioned them, the more their confidence began to crumble. I could see the looks on their faces. The lies weren't working anymore. They couldn't just keep saying, "We have authority," because they had nothing to back it up. The officers weren't buying it. And I knew at that moment that the HOA was about to be exposed for what they really were. A bunch of people who thought they could dictate our lives without any legal right to do so. And that's when things started to escalate quickly. One of the officers pulled out a legal document, something about neighborhood ordinances, and started reading it aloud. I could tell the HOA was in trouble because they went quiet for the first time since all this madness had started. The document essentially stated that a homeowners association did not, under any circumstances, have the power to patrol the neighborhood or impose rules on the residents without the involvement of law enforcement. In other words, everything the HOA had been doing was illegal. When the officer finished reading, the silence was deafening. The HOA board members looked like they had seen a ghost. They had no response, no excuse. They were caught in a lie and they knew it. The police weren't just here to listen to their claims. They were here to make sure the HOA understood they couldn't enforce their ridiculous rules without facing serious consequences. It was a turning point, one that none of us had expected, but one that we were all grateful for. For the first time in weeks, it felt like the power had shifted back into our hands. The police weren't just a backup. They were the ones who had the power to shut the HOA down. As the officers continued their investigation, the rest of us waited, unsure of how this would play out. The HOA members were whispering among themselves, looking more and more desperate. They tried to pull some strings, probably hoping to talk their way out of this, but the officers weren't having any of it. The moment had come. And just as I thought the situation was about to reach its breaking point, the officers looked at us, the residents, and said something that made my blood run cold, but also filled me with a sense of relief. They said that the HOA would have to cease all patrol activities immediately. They didn't just tell them to slow down or reconsider. They were flat out telling them that what they were doing was not just misguided, but illegal. That was it, the turning point. The HOA was about to crumble, and I had to wonder, what would they do next? Would they try to fight back, or had they finally realized that their reign of terror was over? The police had shut them down, but the question remained, what would the HOA try next? The air was thick with tension as we waited for their response. Would they walk away in defeat, or would they lash out? And, more importantly, what did the future hold for the rest of us? We were on the edge of something big, and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through me. The moment the police had forced the HOA to cease their private patrols, I thought we were finally done. I thought the situation had cooled off, that we could go back to living our lives in peace without the constant fear of being watched or fined for trivial things. But just when I thought the storm had passed, a new twist in the tale appeared. One night, as I was sitting on my porch enjoying a quiet evening, my phone buzzed with a text message from an anonymous source. At first, I thought it was just one of those random marketing texts or some spam, but as I opened it, I realized it was much more significant than that. The message was short, but it carried an impact that immediately caught my attention. The HOA has been hiding something big. You won't believe what they've been doing behind closed doors. My heart started racing as I stared at the text. I didn't know whether it was a joke or if it was real, but the words felt like they had a weight to them. I immediately forwarded the message to my closest friends in the neighborhood, hoping they could shed some light on this. But none of us knew what to make of it. What could the HOA possibly be hiding? What kind of secrets were they keeping from us? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how much we didn't know about the people who had been controlling our neighborhood. They were so secretive, so adamant about their special authority, that it felt like there was more to them than we had ever seen. Was there something shady going on behind the scenes? Could this all just be the tip of the iceberg? That's when I decided I had to investigate. I couldn't just sit back and wonder. If there was something the HOA was hiding, I was going to find out what it was. I started looking into the board members, digging into their pasts, their business dealings, anything I could get my hands on. The first step was to look into public records, and what I found shocked me to my core. One of the board members, let's call him Carl, had a history of making questionable financial decisions. A few years back, he had been involved in a real estate project that had gone south. There were rumors that he had been trying to get out of debt by taking shortcuts, but it wasn't just his business dealings that raised my eyebrows. It was his connections. Carl had close ties with several local developers and construction companies. And when I took a closer look at some of the HOA's decisions over the years, I realized something unsettling. Many of the projects they'd approved seemed to benefit those very same developers. The more I dug, the clearer it became. The HOA wasn't just a group of overzealous neighbors enforcing petty rules. They were a corrupt organization, and the board members were using their positions to line their own pockets. This wasn't about protecting the neighborhood anymore. This was about power, money, and influence. My next move was to go deeper into the financials of the HOA itself. I requested access to the association's financial records, a move that I thought might be risky but necessary. When I finally got my hands on the documents, I nearly dropped them in shock. It wasn't just Carl. There was a whole network of people in the HOA who had been profiting from their position. The HOA had been funneling money into projects that only benefited a select few, including several board members who owned shares in the companies that had been hired for neighborhood renovations. It was as if they were running a private little business disguised as a community service. But the most shocking revelation came when I discovered that the HOA had been using the fines and fees they collected to fund some of their personal ventures. Some of the fines had been ridiculous. $100 fines for decorative objects in yards that didn't even violate the neighborhood's guidelines, or fines for something as small as having a flag hanging off a porch. It was clear that the fines weren't about maintaining the integrity of the neighborhood. They were just a way to make money off the residents, with the profits funneling into the pockets of the board members. As I pieced everything together, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The HOA wasn't just corrupt. They were actively using their position to exploit the very people they were supposed to be serving. They were manipulating the rules to their advantage, taking money from residents under the guise of fines and using their authority to get ahead financially. But even after all these discoveries, I knew there was more to the story. The deeper I dug, the more I realized how far-reaching their corruption really was. I wasn't the only one who had been affected by their greed. It turned out that several other residents had been hit with outrageous fines that were completely unjustified. And when I started comparing notes with my neighbors, I began to hear stories of intimidation and coercion. The HOA wasn't just unfair, they were using fear tactics to get what they wanted. One neighbor, Sarah, told me that the HOA had threatened to take legal action against her if she didn't pay a fine for a supposed violation that no one could even define. Another neighbor, Tom, had been warned that his family's house would be devalued if he didn't comply with some vague new rule that seemed to come out of nowhere. It was starting to feel like the HOA was operating like a gang rather than a group of people trying to improve the neighborhood. But the final bombshell came when I discovered the role that some of the more influential residents played in the HOA's shady dealings. It wasn't just the board members who were making money from these corrupt practices. It was the people who had the real power in the neighborhood, the ones with the deep pockets and the political connections. I couldn't believe how deeply entrenched the corruption went. At this point, I was ready to expose everything. The problem was, I wasn't sure how far I could take this. What would happen if the board found out I was the one pulling the strings? Would they try to silence me? Would they threaten me, like they had done to so many others? I had to be careful, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the only way to stop this madness was to blow the lid off their secrets. I couldn't let them get away with it any longer. As I prepared to take action, I knew that the coming days would be crucial. This wasn't just about standing up for myself. It was about standing up for everyone in the neighborhood who had been hurt by the HOA's manipulation. The secret was out, and I wasn't going to let it stay buried. What came next would change everything. But the real question was, how far would the HOA go to protect their secrets? Would they try to cover their tracks? Or was this the beginning of the end for their reign of terror? The tension was at its peak. The HOA had crossed the line. They had been using their so-called special authority to police the neighborhood, sending out their so-called private patrol to spy on residents and issue fines for the most ridiculous reasons. People were getting fed up, and I was right there with them. It wasn't just about my own battle anymore. It had become a fight for the entire community. As the HOA's grip tightened, the sense of injustice was felt by everyone. It felt like they were getting away with it all, until the moment came that changed everything. I had spent weeks gathering evidence. I wasn't just sitting around complaining. I was documenting everything. Each infraction, every unhinged HOA rule, and the unjust fines, everything was ready to be exposed. The tipping point came when I got word that the HOA had taken things even further. They'd gone rogue, hiring a private security company to patrol the neighborhood as if they were the local law enforcement. They were watching everything, from kids playing outside to residents mowing their lawns. It felt like a complete invasion of privacy, and it was clear the HOA had lost sight of any semblance of fairness. But what happened next was nothing short of epic. I knew that the HOA's tactics needed to be stopped, and the only way to do that was to bring in the authorities. But this wasn't just about calling the police. It was about gathering enough proof to ensure they couldn't escape justice. I wasn't alone in this. My neighbors had finally had enough too. Together, we filed official complaints, and I presented everything I had to the local authorities. We weren't just fighting a few petty fines anymore. We were exposing a full-blown operation that was targeting residents for their own benefit. When the police arrived, it was like the final boss battle in a video game. There was a mixture of excitement and anxiety in the air, but I was determined. The HOA board members tried to brush it off, claiming they had the legal right to enforce their rules, but the police weren't buying it. After reviewing everything we had provided, documents, photos, even videos of the private patrols, they knew they had to take action. The moment the officers told the HOA that their private patrols were officially being shut down, the entire neighborhood seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. It felt like justice had been served. The sense of powerlessness that had plagued us for so long was finally over. But it didn't end there. The police didn't just stop with the patrols. They launched an investigation into the HOA's financial practices and their use of residence fines. The corruption was exposed on a larger scale than anyone had expected. The HOA was forced to dissolve their so-called special authority, and the residents of the neighborhood were finally free from the tyranny they had been living under. As the HOA's reign crumbled, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. We had stood up for what was right, and we had won. The power that they had abused for so long was now in the hands of the people, and we weren't going to let it go to waste. The victory wasn't just mine, it was everyone's. It was the triumph of justice over corruption, of standing up against those who think they can control us without consequence. But what I've learned from this experience is that the fight isn't always over once the authorities step in. The HOA may be gone, but there are always people in positions of power who will try to take advantage. That's why it's important for all of us to stay vigilant. Our story might have ended with a win, but there are so many more like it out there. So, I urge you to stay aware, to stand up when things feel wrong, and to always fight for what's fair. If you found yourself relating to this story, or if you want to see more stories like mine, real, raw, and full of twists, hit that subscribe button. You don't want to miss out on the next big battle, and trust me, there's always more. So, if you enjoyed this journey with me, make sure to hit like, comment, and subscribe. Join our community where we expose the truth, fight the system, and remind everyone that no matter how big the opposition, the people will always have the power. Don't miss out. There's a lot more coming your way. Stay tuned, and remember, when the HOA's trying to control your life, it's time to take action.